Cities Tour. You're watching American History TV all weekend, every weekend on C-SPAN 3.
This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Chicago Democratic Convention. Next on American History TV, a panel discussion on the artist's role during the chaotic 1968 presidential nominating convention. Scholars explored the impact of musicians and their messages, and writer Norman Mailer's account of the events. They also talk about visual artists' activism and the numerous underground newspapers of the time. Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism hosted this event. It's an hour and 45 minutes.
I'm Abe Peck. I'm a professor emeritus in service here at the Medill School of Mouthful, Journalism, Media Integrated Marketing Communications. I'm also 50 years out for being an underground newspaper editor during that week in 1968, which is indelibly stamped in Chicago history and certainly Chicago media history. Tonight's the third of four stops on our collective Medill journey to explore media and the 1968 Democratic Convention. Throughout, our recent dean, Brad Ham, who's here tonight, and our current leader, Charles Whitaker, is also here tonight, and he'll be on a panel next month. Plus our organizing committee, some of whom are here, and Medill staff have supported us greatly. So thank you, guys and gals. We kicked off in May with legendary Chicago broadcaster Bill Curtis' highly visual look at the events of Convention Week. Bill's new two-hour TV special about the convention will premiere on the Decades Network Monday, August 6th at 8 p.m. Central. And it'll be aired throughout August on decades.com. For our June session, we had four historians, activists, and reporters talking about the Rashomon-like perspectives behind the week's conflicts, from politicians to protesters to police. Some of you were here for that. C-SPAN was here for that one, and the network's taping aired July 7th on C-SPAN 3's American History TV. You can view it online just by finding the link. That brings us to tonight and the artistic convention. Rock music specific to the convention was largely suppressed by the city's refusal to grant permits. The pulsing beats and penetrating lyrics were in the air and on the airwaves. Literary figures from Norman Mailer to Allen Ginsberg convened to cover the political and cultural collision. And from overground art, painting, to protest papers, underground and overground, artists and media workers produced interpretations sparked by protests, nightsticks, and tear gas. Our speakers will cover these topics tonight, and I'll introduce each speaker in turn, starting with Anthony Decurtis. Anthony is a longtime contributing editor for Rolling Stone, where we knew each other, a Grammy Award winner, a distinguished lecturer in creative writing at the University of Pennsylvania, and a PhD in American literature from Indiana University. Anthony is the author of Lou Reed, A Life, his newest book. In other words, and Rocking My Life Away, and co-writer of Clive Davis's autobiography, The Soundtrack of My Life, a New York Times bestseller. And FYI, panelist books are available after the presentation, behind the curtain. Right now, though, Anthony will chart how rock provided the pulsing beat for '68, for the changes, and perhaps speak to its role today. Anthony?
Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you. I'm just going to, we're going to kind of, I'm going to not exactly read this, but I mean, there's a lot to talk about with 1968, and, hopefully, we'll get to most of it. I took a song lyric that probably most of you know, a quote from A Street Fighting Man by the Rolling Stones. And, what can a poor boy do except sing for a rock and roll band? In sleepy London town, there's just no place for a street fighting man. It's like Jagger wrote those lyrics after attending a Vietnam protest in London, in which the protesters were kind of pushed away from the American embassy by Chicago standards, rather polite London cops. Nonetheless, they did have batons and were using them. But Jagger complained to the event's organizers that the protesters should have fought back. They should not have yielded. The song was banned by the BBC, and Jagger sent the lyrics to a British underground magazine called The Black Dwarf. It was run by a guy named Tariq Ali, who was sort of a major London political activist. And he gave them permission to reprint them. You know, the song, though, captures, I think, some of the complexity of artists engaging in political action. You know, the song, kind of like the Beatles song Revolution, which John Lennon wrote, which came out in 1968 also. You know, Lennon was kind of agonizing over, you know, what the role of the Beatles and, you know, musicians should be at that time. And, you know, there's the famous line, but if you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out? Then in a much harsher re-recorded version, you know, Lennon sings, don't you know that you can count me out in? Mm-hmm. And you know, I don't think anything, you know, kind of captures the ambivalence that, you know, artists felt. You know, it's one thing to go to a benefit, and it's one thing to make a donation. It's one thing to show up somewhere and play some songs. But it quickly became clear to people that regardless of the kind of beliefs and convictions that they held, you know, about the Vietnam War and other issues, coming to Chicago is going to be a different story. Back to Jagger, I mean, the Black Dwarf, you know, it's a little hard to reconstruct exactly, you know, how seriously political the Stones seemed in 1968. I mean, you know, now, you know, they're still actively touring and playing quite well, I have to say. But, you know, I don't think anybody expects them to be revolutionaries. In 1968, people did. And there was actually a story in the Black Dwarf with the headline, Marx, Engels, Mick Jagger. And you know, this was something that was, you know, in the air. You know, the kind of counterculture was forming. There was a sense of rock and roll, you know, partly by virtue of Dylan's going electric, infused rock and roll with, you know, some of the social ambition and idealism of folk music. At that very moment that he started playing rock and roll, of course, Dylan more or less abandoned politics. But, you know, people did look to, you know, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and other artists of that time, James Brown, you know, for, you know, some kind of political insight, political guidance, and political vision. And, you know, the year before, in 1967, there was a kind of, there was a sense of a kind of revolution of consciousness. You know, people talked about the Summer of Love. You know, the Beatles were kind of central figures in that, you know, Sgt. Pepper. This idea that, you know, if you took LSD or if you altered your consciousness, you would alter the world. By 1968, people had moved away from that idea. Part of what radicalized people was what went on here in Chicago at that convention. But people were getting radicalized by other events as well. Things were moving very quickly. You know, but as Tariq Ali said at one point, culture is intervening in politics. But in 1967, there was the Summer of Love, Revolution of Consciousness. But by early 1968, you had the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which made it clear that you know, there was no light at the end of the tunnel. You know, it was a, you know, very the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese were, you know, kind of launched attacks across South Vietnam that really made it clear that the war was nowhere near over and that it was going to be a fight. You know, that was not something that Americans were pleased to hear or prepared to hear. Of course, there was the murder of Martin Luther King in April of 1968. And also the riots that resulted from that, which, you know, here in Chicago provided something of the backdrop to some of the stuff that went on at the convention. There was the shooting of Andy Warhol in 1968, the murder of Robert Kennedy, and of course the rebellions in Paris. that was one of the things that that was one of the things that also, Jagger saw as an inspiration, writing Street Fighting Man. But in a way that it would have been unthinkable just a few years before that you would have expected rock and roll stars to show up, at a demonstration. That was something that was anticipated in 1968. Some of the organizers of what became known as the Festival of Life, the point of view of Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin and the Yippies was that the Democratic Convention was a festival of death. They were the architects of the Vietnam War, but they wanted to have a more anarchic festival of life. The problem with that was that the anarchy kind of leaked into things like the preparation for what the demonstrations were going to be. Musicians were seen as standard bearers, and they certainly tried to get musicians to come, but increasingly, as kind of word leaked out, largely, from the Yippies themselves. I mean, they were talking about things like, pouring LSD in the water system in Chicago, and all kinds of kind of crazy stuff that if you were thinking about going there, it also had the effect of dampening the turnout for the at least what was predicted to be the turnout for those demonstrations, and certainly were the turnouts for demonstrations before and after in other parts of the country, because there was a perception that it was going to be a kind of dangerous scene. One of the musicians that they tried to recruit was Country Joe Mcdonald, who would the following year give a rousing performance at the Woodstock Festival. But he said he was interested in coming and performing. He arranged for some shows at that weekend at the Electric Theater in town, and he said that he would talk to other musicians about coming. But as they got closer, and certainly it was becoming clear how the city of Chicago was going to respond to demonstrations and what the demonstrations were going to be like, when Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman went to see Country Joe at the Electric Theater here in town to ask him, well, are you going to be performing at the Festival of Life? This was Country Joe describing this at the, actually during the trial of the Chicago 7 as he was testifying. I said to Abbie Hoffman, no, I was not going to be in the festival because the vibrations in town were so incredibly vicious that I felt it was impossible to avoid violence on the part of the police and the authorities in Chicago. I felt that my group's symbolic support of the festival had to be withdrawn because there would be a possibility that people would follow us to the festival and be clubbed and maced and tear-gassed by the police, and that the possibility of anything positive or loving or good coming out of that city at that time was impossible, and that I had no choice but to withdraw my support. Nonetheless, he was attacked and beaten after his second show by people who kind of recognized him as a hippie and just decided that was enough to warrant his getting a beatdown. The only rock band to perform at the festival was the MC5, from Detroit, a radical band from Michigan associated with the White Panther Party, whose platform consisted of rock and roll, dope, sex in the streets, and the abolition of capitalism. It was led by John Sinclair, and who was himself a poet and an artist and an activist, very and a very sincere one. The MC5 did come to play. As Abe mentioned, the city refused to grant permits, for a stage and for a sound system and all of this. And here's Wayne Kramer, who actually, the guitarist for the MC5, who went 40 years later, in 2008, to Denver to participate in demonstrations at the Democratic Convention there. He goes, you know, every 40 years I go and protest against the Democrats, is what he said. But he was describing what it was like in 1968. There's seconds of footage that you can find of all this, you know, online. But here's his description. There was no stage. There was no flatbed truck. There was no sound system. There were no porta toilets. There was no electricity. We had to run an electrical cord from the hot dog stand to power our gear. We played on the ground in the middle of Lincoln Park in Chicago with the crowd all around us sitting on the ground in the back standing. I'm going to guess there were maybe 3,000 young people there, and it was very tense. The Chicago police had been very aggressive and very intimidating all day. And even though it was a rock concert and we were the only band to play, it didn't feel like a rock concert. There was a dark cloud over the day because we knew the likelihood of people being hurt was great. As soon as we finished playing, the police started attacking the crowd. These waves of blue-helmeted, club-swinging Chicago police officers. A few other artists, I should say, did come to the protests. Phil Ochs, whose work some of you may be familiar with, an extremely powerful and important folk artist, came, and you know, you could see pictures of him performing, and he's just got his acoustic guitar and somebody's holding a microphone in front of him. You know, that was the kind of setup that he had. And Mary Travers and Peter Yarrow from Peter, Paul, and Mary also both came and also performed under, you know, similar circumstances to you know, to what Phil Ochs had. There, you know, as I was, you know, thinking about this, looking back on it, you know, people are always asking me, you know, what's going on now? You know, how does this connect? You know, there are many, I think, connections. Although I have to say, I do believe that the present time is far worse. There was, you know, as polarized as things were then, you know, I think the situation is much more extreme now. And also, you know, but you hear a similar kind of rhetoric. I mean, there was a really, I mean, Phil Ochs, you know, returned from Chicago, you know, just stunned by what had happened here. But, you know, he's talking the kind of talk that, you know, has gotten the left in trouble over the years. They were just saying, we just have to boycott this election. You know, it's not going to make any difference, you know, whether it's Humphrey or Nixon, you know, and obviously, I mean, to one degree or another, that might have been true, but, you know, there finally was a difference between Humphrey and Nixon. There were further rollouts. I mean, obviously, someone like John Sinclair came to John Lennon's attention later. And, you know, as Lennon became friends with Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, he came to Michigan, wrote a song about John Sinclair, and he came there to do a benefit for him. That, of course, led to the FBI investigations of John Lennon and the efforts to deport him. These days, you know, I think, you know, music, you know, there isn't this kind of centrality. You know, there's a lot more media, there's a lot more music around. There are enough issues to keep anybody busy. But, you know, one of the things that people complained about, the Beatles song Revolution, was, you know, the line, "It's going to be all right," which people saw as, you know, this rich guy just thinking, sure, it's all going to work out fine. But, you know, that's the title of a great Kendrick Lamar song that also has become an anthem at the moment. And it was just, you know, rightly seen as a statement of optimism in the face of, you know, tremendous difficulties being faced by the black community and everybody else at the moment. And there's a great, you know, Childish Gambino song called "This Is America" that also has been, I think, an inspiration for many people these days. So this sense of, you know, the connection of music and politics, something we can, you know, continue to talk about. But, you know, it wasn't the presence at the demonstration that it could have been for all of those reasons that I described. So, but thank you very much.
Thanks, Anthony. Well, we're going to take questions at the end. So our next speaker is David Denby. David is a staff writer and film critic for The New Yorker. He, too, is a best-selling author. His books chronicle everything from core curricula to his financial misadventures during the dot-com bust and the rise of snark in social media, an ever-growing topic that probably needs a sequel. Tonight, as he recently did in a very, very good article in Harper's Magazine, David will trace Norman Mailer's literary contributions to the chronicling of late 1967 and 1968. David wrote to me, for all his despair over Vietnam, Mailer's Armies of the Night, a literary journalism masterpiece, is a hopeful book. But Mailer and Miami and the Siege of Chicago chronicles America turning fatally toward disaster. First, the dreaded ascension of Richard Nixon at the Republican convention, and then the chaos of Chicago with Hubert Humphrey, liberal fires long banked, wedded to the platitudes and LBJ's hapless strategy for the war. Mailer's literary legacy, however, survives. David, Miami and the Siege of Chicago, like Armies, is written with an impassioned power of observation and recreation that rivals Whitman's poetry. Here to tell us more about it, David Denby.
Well, you sort of did it. I don't. I'll just. I'm sort of involved in a personal effort of restoration of Mailer's reputation, at least for his nonfiction work. The Library of America is, our Pleiad is bringing out his work now. They've issued a lot of the '60s stuff, including this. I'll get to the reason why he's in such disrepute. I mean, it's pretty obvious, and those of you who have followed these things. This book I've read twice in the last year, and it's in this terrible time, as Anthony said, I have found it fortifying. Mailer got going as a political writer in 1960, and maybe a few people here remember. I was, I guess, in high school, and he covered the Kennedy Convention, and nobody had ever read political journalism quite like that. He began by saying, for once, let us try to think of a political convention without losing ourselves in housing projects of fact and issue. Now, in fact, Mailer was very good at fact and issue when he put his mind to it. He wrote a book about going to the moonshot. He wrote a book about execution of Gary Gilmore, about Lee Harvey Oswald's early life in Russia. But when he got to doing these convention pieces, it was not, delegate counts and so on that he was after, although he had some of it. A convention is a gathering of ambitious and established or insurgent, in some cases, people from all over the country, and he wanted to look at the faces, the bodies, the voices, the sound of crowds, the decor of the rooms. I mean, you can imagine what he would do with this place in positive and negative ways. So to speak, the unconscious of the event, the backwash, everything to get away from ordinary reporting, with the intent of capturing the soul of the country. And with the secondary intent of marshaling physical evidence into some sort of powerful series of metaphors. He put himself into the center of the action. Why? Because as he records what he perceives, he's also, his consciousness of what he's doing and what he's seeing is changing, and he's having fresh perceptions from a slightly different, further point down the road of consciousness. In other words, it's a kind of positive loop, positive feedback loop. Anyone who ever tries to do this will fall dead in about 5 pages if you even get that far. So in no way is this a model for anyone else. Now, when you talk of his virtues, what I hinted at, I might as well just give you an example of what the problem is. This is from the Kennedy piece. It's nothing terrible. It indicates a kind of period and personal attitudes. One of the private amusements of the convention was to divine some of the qualities of the candidates by the style of the young women who put on hats and clothing and politicked in the colors of one presidential gent or another. Of course, half of them must have been hired models, but someone did the hiring. And it's fair to look for a common denominator. The Johnson girls tended to be plump, pie-faced, dumb, sexy Southern. The Symington, that's the Stuart Symington, girls seemed to touch mulish, stubborn, good-looking pluggers. The Kennedy ladies were the handsomest. But the Stevenson girls looked to be doing it for no money. They were good sorts, slightly horsey-faced. One had the impression they played field hockey in college. Well, all right, it's funny, and it's not inaccurate because women were not in high estate at political conventions in 1960. But I couldn't help thinking, if those were posses of men, he might have looked for some sign of resistance in those faces to their assigned task. And in other words, it was assumed that women would simply be herded around and play dumb. He covered the Goldwater Convention, also for Esquire, and then Armies of the Night, which is, I think, an American prose masterpiece. October 1967, I don't know how many people it was, 100,000 or so come up to Washington to invest the Pentagon, meaning to try to charge into its halls. A few people actually did get in there. You can imagine what happened to them. And the hippies from California and New York also intended to levitate the Pentagon 3 feet. I see some people nodding. With Hindu chants, right? If I got the religion right.
Out, demon, out.
Out, and saying out, demon, out. The point was to raise it 3 feet off the ground and to exorcise it of its poison. That gives you an idea of the late 60s. It was a kind of, as well as despair and violence, a kind of manic creativity. I mean, no other argument had worked in trying to end the war. Why not try this one? The text came out in Harper's, most of it, and the last portion in commentary, and then you heard the dreadful events of the spring and early summer of '68, a sense that the country was coming apart, unraveling. The Republican convention of August 3rd through the 9th was a reactionary attempt to ravel it back up again. And I must say that Mailer gives the devil his due. He looks for signs of the new Nixon. I don't know if you remember the new Nixon, as opposed to the awful, phony Dick Nixon of 1952, who embarrassed those of us who had more delicate sensibilities, even if we were 8. And he does. He parses Nixon's speeches, and he has his Mailer way of doing it, which is to interject himself into the lines of the speech with sort of interrogation, with comments, with sarcasm, with suspense. What's he going to do next, like that? So you have a kind of intercourse between the two of them on the page. On to Chicago. The book begins with evocation of Chicago. He felt the chagrin that all New Yorkers feel when they come to Chicago, because it's an even greater city than New York. That's been my impression the last few days. He does it, the architecture, the river, the stockyards, which were still in operation in 1968. The smell of the stockyards, the fabulous Mailer nose, that could smell a fart at 100 paces. He can smell the stockyards all, every night, all through the convention, and the awful depression that hung over the convention for many reasons. First of all, the death of Bobby Kennedy in June, and the convention practically comes to a dead halt. I'm going to ask you to hold this. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. Somewhere between sorrow and the blind sword of patriotism was the fulcrum of reasonable politics. And as the film progressed, the film that was shown at the convention devoted to Bobby Kennedy, One saw scene after scene of Robert Kennedy growing older. A kind of happiness came back from the image, for something in his face grew young over the years. He looked more like a boy on the day of his death, a nice boy, nicer than the kid with the sharp, rocky glint in his eye who had gone to work for Joe McCarthy in the early 20s and had then known everything there was to know about getting ahead in politics. He had grown modest as he grew older, and his wit had grown with him. He had become a funny man, as the picture took care to show, wry, simple for one instant, shy and off to the side on the next, but with a sort of marvelous boy's wisdom, as if he knew the world was very bad and knew the intimate style of how it was bad, as only boys can sometimes know. I found this in particular, that passage, moving because I saw Bobby Kennedy 3 days before he died give a speech to a Latino audience in San Jose, California, and it was exactly as he says. He was shy, and then he was empathic, he was funny. It was a fantastic performance. LBJ controlled the convention in order to get Humphrey through, but as you know, there was still chaos. The delegates in fistfights, the media roughed up, and all the chaos outside. The underlying question for Mailer was, how could the delegates not understand that the only way the party could beat Dick Nixon was to turn against the war? And there's many pages devoted to how politics works in terms of obligations and favors and property. Another element of the tragedy was the figure of Eugene McCarthy, who was a brilliant man in many ways, who had great courage to take on Johnson at all in the spring of 1968, and who was infuriatingly diffident. He was unemphatic in his speech. He would not rile up the crowd. He would not play the game. He was not a mixer. He seemed like a professor. You know, he wrote poetry and hung out with Robert Lowell and all the stuff that drove me nuts. I was for Bobby. And Mailer devotes pages of interviewing him, talking to him, and comes out with great respect for his toughness. McCarthy said something that now, to me at least, is heartbreaking. He said on the day of the nominating convention, the nominating speeches and so on, meaning him and his supporters, we're not asking for much, just a modest use of intelligence. Just a modest use of intelligence. Now, heard now, this has to be the most heartbreaking sentence in American politics. I mean, a modest use of intelligence seems completely utopian and beyond. There is a prescient passage in this book in which Mailer says that that white people's irritation with blacks pressing their demands would lead somewhere down the road to a demagogue who would take power and move the country to the right. I mean, I'm not reading it, but it's there. That was written, in the summer of 1968. As against the mildness of McCarthy, the power drive of the Daily Machine, the mayor not to have his city taken over by Jewish and WASP media elites from California and New York and long-haired faggots or whatever he thought they were, with their foul mouths and free love, politics is property, and this was his property. He can't face Humphrey. It makes him so sick. But then there are these descriptions of Daley's goons. They were sitting right in front of the dais, so that McCarthy or anyone else who was anti-war had to face them. Some of them had eyes like drills, others noses like plows, jaws like amputated knees. They combed their hair straight with a part to the side in imitation of the mayor, who from up close had a red skin with many veins and hair which looked like the dirty gray silk combed out straight. At his worst, Daley looked, in fact, like a vastly robust old peasant woman with a dirty gray silk wig. At any rate, no small matter to have the Illinois delegation under your nose at the podium, all those hecklers, fixers, flunkies, and muscle men scanning the audience as if to freeze certain obstreperous faces, make them candidates for a contract and a hit. So, gangsters in the flesh. At this time, Miller's not a participant. In Washington, he threw himself, towards the military police, got himself arrested, and makes a long scene and everything about being arrested in the night he spent in jail and so on. He pulls back for various reasons, the most salient of which is that he calculates he can't write 30 or 40,000 words, whatever it is, for Harper's in the next 3 or 4 weeks to get it into the magazine before the election if he's been clubbed and maced. He also says, maybe I'm just scared. You cannot deny this guy the most engaging candor, even if you find him pretentious and overbearing. He loathes what's happening to his country, and he also loves his country. He's no revolutionary. He's 45. He has 6 children and 2 houses, for God's sakes. So he withdraws to the Hilton, but he has a different kind of experience, and it shows that for a journalist that perspective, even if you've got, seemingly the wrong perspective, can be put to use. From within the Hilton, under siege, on the 3rd day of the convention, where is it, Dave? The Hilton heaved and staggered through a variety of attacks and breakdowns like an old fort, like the old fort of the old Democratic Party about to fall forever beneath the ministrations of its high shaman, its excruciated warlock, that's LBJ, derided by the young, held in contempt by its own soldiers, the very delegates who would be loyal to Humphrey in the nomination and loyal to nothing in their heart. This spiritual fort of the Democratic Party was now housed in the literal fort of the Hilton, staggering in places, all boilers working, all motors vibrating, yet seeming to come apart from the pressures on the street outside, as if the old Hilton had become artifact of the party and the nation. The police had tried to gas the kids out of the park when they first arrived in numbers from Lincoln Park, but the wind blew the wrong way, blew the tears across the street into the air conditioning of the Hilton lobby, and delegates and press and officials walked about with smarting eyes, burning throats, and the presentiment that they were going to catch a cold. The lobby stunk. So the hippies didn't put LSD in the water supply, but the tear gas got into, so to speak, the body politic, the Hilton, and it was talk about the backwash of the event, the unconscious of the event. It was part of the breathing itself. The next day, the police rioted, and there was a sickening attack on the peaceful march down Michigan. And just a little bit of that, I have a few minutes. There, damned by police on 3 sides and cut off from the wagons of the Poor People's March, there right beneath the windows of the Hilton, which looked down on Grant Park and Michigan Avenue, the stationary march was abruptly attacked. The police attacked with tear gas, with mace, and with clubs. They attacked like a chainsaw, cutting into wood. The teeth of the saw, the edge of their clubs. They attacked like a scythe through grass. Lines of 20 and 30 policemen striking out in the arc, their clubs beating, demonstrators fleeing. Seen from overhead from the 19th floor, it was like a wind blowing dust or the edge of waves riding foam on the shore. Everyone said at the time, and you've probably heard it if you've been to these earlier meetings of this conference, it was Vietnam on Michigan Avenue. It was Vietnam. It was power. It was devastation. The next day, he made an appearance before the kids who were left, and he apologized profusely for being yellow and not joining them. And he was very touched because bunches of them said, "Write it. Write it." So I have, and then he wrote this in a few weeks. I have found this book fortifying in the last 2 years, the last year or so, and I've read it twice, because as Anthony said, this time is even worse than 68. I mean, at least the Democratic Party is not, enshrined in chagrin and dismay. I mean, it's not rift in that way. There isn't that rift. but the intensity of his response to a different set of circumstances, with occasional prescient shafts, such as I mentioned, have just been so powerful to read as prose and as emotion, as sensibility, as taste, as literature, that I have felt stronger just by reading these books, this book twice. So thank you very much.
Thanks, David. We're going to switch over to a kind of more visual element here. First brought to us by Patricia Kelly. Trish is an associate professor of contemporary art history and associate dean at Carr University of Art and Design in British Columbia. She holds a PhD from the University of British Columbia, but she has roots in Chicago. She's a former professor at DePaul. Trish has written extensively on art and architecture, including the essay Art and Politics, Chicago Style, 2008, for an exhibit at DePaul University's Art Museum. Tonight, Trish is going to illustrate herself how the city's artists and painters responded to the week's official violence. Trish?
Great, thanks. Okay, thanks, everyone. First of all, I wanted to say thanks to Abe and to the great staff at Medill for helping us and acclimatizing all of us to the presentation tonight. So thanks so much for that. Tonight, I want to really think about some questions like what exactly... Is it not on? Oh, just closer. Okay. So I want to think about some questions tonight, like what exactly is the relationship between politics and art in Chicago today? In what ways and through what material forms does art redefine itself in relation or in response to ideological conflict? And also, what are the strategies that visual artists use to intervene in and perhaps redefine pressing social concerns? While the tensions between politics and art are not new in 1968, I'm arguing that the events in Chicago in late August functioned as a pressure point of sorts within the art establishment. And by that, I mean high-end art galleries, artists who were, trading for lots of money and collected by very wealthy Chicago patrons. And specifically, I want to think about what are the ways in which that convention and the artistic response reset that relationship. And in that way, participatory democracy and committed social activism, evident in the protest movement and certainly on the streets at the time, set off discursive debates regarding the potential of culture to contribute to and even transform political or social circumstances. The contemplative art viewer that stands stationary in front of a painting on a gallery wall was at this moment reconstituted as an active, embodied, engaged participant. And that has implications even today. And at the end, I'll talk just a little bit about what that means to Chicago art today. But we can always get more to that in the question and answer period. Sure. Okay, sure. 1 sec, everyone. Don't look, it's preview. You want to see it live.
No, I think they need them.
I did want to remind all of you that there are screens back there. I was thinking I was going to be in a larger space, so my slides are a little small, and I apologize for that. But if you need to, you can always turn around, or I can send you the images later if you'd like. I'm used to big lecture halls with big screens. Okay, thanks, Rafi. Okay, this is not to say that art protest was new to Chicago in 1968. In fact, a vibrant community of activists, artist-sponsored activism, began in the 1950s with the Monster Roster and others, specifically emanating out of Hyde Park. But it took a decidedly anti-war turn in 1966 with the formation of Chicago Artists Against the War in Vietnam, which was a branch of a New York organization. And Dominic DeMeo, whose work you see here, is one founding member of that group. Artists such as DeMeo, Robert Donnelly, Donald Mayne, and Jim Falconer founded this branch of Artists Against the War, with DeMeo's Kinzie Street studio serving as a base of operations. And this is the kind of image that was produced. So images of very propagandistic, quite crass in their representational strategies, meant to very clearly portray the message. DeMeo produced this while a faculty member at the Art Institute made a bunch of copies and handed it out on Michigan Avenue to students and tourists alike, trying to kind of drum up some anti-war sentiment. But this kind of straight-up art propaganda is very different from what he was producing at the same time. So here's one of his collage paintings of the same moment, his untitled Yellow Background with Skull. And while this work often would show skull, bones, appendages, there was no kind of direct correlation between the collage paintings and what was happening in current political events. So, and that slippage between what artists were doing in their forms of activism and what they were doing in their own studio work is very common at that time. Here we just see one of two images I'm going to show you of protest march that the group participated in. You can see their banner in the background there, Chicago Artists for Peace in Vietnam. And at the time, DeMeo, among other members of the group, were really mirroring what was happening in other American cities. So artists were often banding together for political activism, sometimes producing props or imagery, such as you see in the slide on the bottom, where these skulls were produced by Miriam Brovsky, and a Chicago artist who was very much working to produce these kind of props for just to bring kind of further attention to the group's participation in these protest marches. So Chicago Artists Against the War in Vietnam, like groups in New York, we have groups in New York that are doing Angry Arts Weeks or producing portfolios of anti-war images for sale to fund different protest organizations, but largely it stayed out of their own practice or imagery. But here I'm showing you work by Barnett Newman, who I'm going to talk a little bit about later in the discussion. And just to think about what was the norm then for studio production in New York, Chicago at the time. And there were some differences, but I'll get to that as well. So such emergent political activism amongst artists in the 1960s and the resultant shifts in the manner of representation that they enacted needs to really be put in context with what were dominant artistic modes of the day. And in the US, overtly propagandistic art was very much not popular, specifically because of a Cold War context. So coming out of the Cold War, any kind of propagandistic art was very much seen as Soviet or communist in nature. And so typically we saw US artists, at least those artists who were selling well, moving more towards abstraction. But that doesn't mean it wasn't political, as we see with Barnett Newman's, one of his Stations of the Cross here, one of 14 paintings he produced right around 1964 and 1965, but which kind of stand in tonight for his typical style. Newman is known for these large-scale paintings which show vertical stripes, what he later called zips, in part in response to the pop artist Andy Warhol's fame. So he's looking for something a little more jazzy to talk about in relation to his work. And those vertical stripes or zips became for Newman a stand-in for the human condition. So, so Newman, and this was his signature style from 1948 onward, very much saw his work as existential in nature. He was a devout anarchist, was against the US government completely. And in fact, he once argued about this work in 1964. When asked what this work meant by someone who was interviewing, he said, if people really understood it, it would be the end of all state capitalist and totalitarian society. Pretty big claim for a stripe. However, that was the kind of authenticity and commitment that Newman brought to his practice, and he wasn't alone. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work of Jackson Pollock, who similarly saw in that drip painting a kind of existential crisis of the individual. So this was the politics that Newman was invested in prior to 1968. But as we'll see in a few minutes, one brief kind of blip or response to the 1968 Democratic Convention, this kind of work was not really political enough. And again, to think about in that lingering Cold War climate, the most influential art critic of the day, his name is Clement Greenberg, read such work. So despite Newman's claim it was political, he read such work as being just largely formal in nature, so not really connected to that political comment. In fact, when Greenberg was speaking in 1967 to Phil Leiter, then editor of Art Forum, a new art periodical of the day, still a pretty important art periodical, argued, quote, "I prefer to live as if there's no connection between politics and art," unquote, to which Greenberg readily agreed. So that sense of, what can the art object do was pretty repressed. Then bring that to Chicago, and I really think this juxtaposition of slides kind of demonstrates the conundrum. By the time of the convention, 1968 had already been a pretty difficult year. On April 4th, Martin Luther King was assassinated. On June 5th, Bobby Kennedy. When Vice President Hubert Humphrey won the Democratic nomination, many felt the election itself was meaningless. And that brings up the events in Chicago. On the one side, on the right, we have Mayor Daley, an autocratic leader who vowed to maintain stability in his city at all cost. In the weeks leading up to the convention, Daley denied public permits for marches and demonstrations, doubled the strength of the Chicago police force, and brought in the U.S. Army and the Illinois National Guard, saying, and I quote, "As long as I'm mayor of this city, there will be law and order on the streets," unquote. On the other hand, as represented here by just one of the flyers from the Yippie Festival of Life, we have Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin of the Yippies who organized what they called an invasion of Chicago, complete with demonstrations, I guess as Anthony has told us, limited public concerts, and other kinds of activities meant to really bring a kind of farcical view of the proceedings. In fact, so farcical that they nominate a pig, Pegasus, for president. To promote the events, the Yippies also published flyers, much like what you're seeing here, and held rallies that were meant to really circulate farcical rumors, such as Yippies would pick up delegates at the airport and drive them to Wisconsin, or hyper-potent male Yippies would be used to seduce delegate wives. Or, as already was mentioned, LSD would be dumped in the city's water supply. And I think the one that the mayor really took seriously, surrounding the amphitheater and barbed wire protection, that the amphitheater would be stormed. Such tactics really played on the paranoia of the city's conservative constituents to incite fear, confusion, misunderstanding, a kind of form of guerrilla performance art, I would argue, reliant on improvisation and satire. Here are just a couple scenes of the protests, and the clash between Daley's forces, of course, and protesters began almost immediately, with the violence intensifying as the convention wore on. One of the worst confrontations taking place on the 26th, in front of the headquarters of the Democratic Party, the Hilton Hotel at the corner of Michigan and Balboa Avenues. As protesters hurled rocks, bottles, and expletives, the police fought back with mace, clubs, and even motorcycles, as chronicled in the Walker Report, were used by some patrolmen to run down people in the streets. And I apologize again for the smallness of the slide. So here's where I'm going to get to the artistic response. So immediately artists responded to this conundrum. We have one of the first artists to respond was Barnett Newman, who wrote a letter on September 3rd to the Art Institute, then director Charles Cunningham, to ask that his own work be removed from an upcoming exhibition, arguing that he didn't want to be part of an exhibition in a city where such brutality was imminent. A few days later, Jesse Rychek, a professor of painting at Berkeley, and a New York artist, Hedda Stern, proposed a 2-year art boycott of the city, asking artists, and they got over 75 artists reported about this in the New York Times with all the artists listed, who said that they would not show any work in Chicago for 2 years. They argued at that time, quote, "The recent actions by Chicago police, directed and supported by Mayor Daley, have marked the city as unfit for membership in a civilized society. As painters and sculptors, we know that art cannot exist where repression and brutality are tolerated." The same day, Klaus Oldenburg, an artist who had grew up in Chicago, who was at the convention and caught up quite literally in the violence, sent a letter to the Chicago art dealer, Richard Feigen, which you see, well, you probably don't see here, but it is there, canceling a one-man show at Feigen's gallery scheduled to open October 23rd. And in the letter, he argues, quote, "A gentle one-man show about pleasure seems a bit obscene in the present context," unquote. Never the bad businessman Richard Feigen, as a way to avert a negative impact the boycott would have on Chicago museums and gallery, he proposed an alternative, the Richard J. Daley Protest Show, an exhibition intended to demonstrate the outrage of many left-leaning artists. Many of the artists initially agreeing to a boycott now changed their allegiance to participate in the show. One New York artist participating in the show was James Rosenquist. Rosenquist here produced the figure of Mayor Daley became a dominant symbol throughout the show, is perhaps not surprising. Here, Rosenquist, who's known for his silkscreen work, produced a silkscreen of Daley's head on pink and white plastic that was actually cut. So that, as you can see on the image that was printed in Newsweek in a review of the show, the viewer can actually participate in the work by disrupting those pink ribbons. And in another point in the exhibition, it was hung in the center of the gallery with a fan behind it so that the image could never be completely still. So some artists, like Rosenquist here, were interested in making direct political statements, producing work parodying the image of Mayor Daley himself. The New York Times, and that was common, we'll see a few more of them in a minute, but the New York Times estimated that the show was so popular about 10,000 people came to the exhibition before it traveled to the Contemporary Arts Center in Cincinnati, where it opened on December 20th in '68, and then a reduced version of the show, which included, I think, only about 40 works. There were 65 in the original show, made a brief stop in Feigen's gallery in New York. So we had one gallery at the time in Chicago, another one in New York. His gallery in New York still exists. Another work, Calling Up Mayor Daley, on the left by Klaus Oldenburg, a drawing, one of two drawings he did for a colossal monument in Chicago, which was subtitled Daley's Head on a Platter. So meant to be, and he cited it right on, basically in Grant Park. And on the right, he created 50 of the images that you see here, a kind of reworking or remaking of the very distinctive Chicago fire hydrant. When they were originally installed in Feigen's gallery, they were all put together on the floor. Each one's a couple feet tall, and they look like little bodies, kind of, each one was individualized, little bodies kind of broken or reworked. Reviews of the show in the Chicago Trib and the New York Times described it as eclectic, exciting, and visually overwhelming, with artists working in a variety of representational and abstract styles. No clear consensus on how to register dissent or how to actually articulate a response to the political violence was really kind of forthcoming. Grace Kluick in the New York Times argued, quote, "By and large, the show goes in for the quick journalistic jab, relying heavily on boyish scatology, name-calling, and sight gags to make its protest points." Kluick's assessment underscores the larger dilemma facing artists interested in using their work as a direct means of ideological engagement: how to maintain artistic integrity or avoid the trap of pure propaganda. And there's also a kind of tension that comes out of Feigen's show between New York and Chicago. About 2/3 of the artists in the show were from New York, many of which were not here during the week of convention-related violence. So this actually speaks a little bit to it. Hans Breder, a German artist, but who lived in the Midwest in Iowa and was here at the Chicago protests, produced a work that looks a lot like Robert Morris, a very famous at the time minimalist artist in New York, his mirrored cubes, but this time they're shot through with a rifle. Some artists, though, felt they couldn't respond, and in fact they needed to include the kind of signature work that had always been connected to, such as Robert Motherwell here. Motherwell was an artist who long had a history of political commitment and activism in liberal causes, but didn't want to show work that actually called that forth, was instead really interested in producing work or lending work that called up his abstract paintings. But here's the piece I want to get to, a piece that was produced in '68 by Barnett Newman, specifically in relation to what's happening, one of two monuments that he produced in response to the show, this one called Lace Curtain for Mayor Daley. And I think this demonstrates the kind of complications artists were really facing. 6 foot by 4 foot barbed wire sculpture splattered with red paint, a kind of blood-like red paint, was meant by Newman to really call up some of the actual crowd pushers that were used by Jeeps during the convention violence. And so here we have that zip that we saw in his previous work doesn't really do it anymore, right? You have to go to something more direct, more propagandistic. Newman's work also, and I just want to flip back to this slide here just so you can think about the title of the work, was actually a direct response to Mayor Daley on the convention floor. The networks muted his mic at the time, but Abraham Ribicoff, a senator from Illinois, was speaking, and Daley hurled anti-Semitic slurs at him. So in response, Newman, a Jewish artist from New York, hurls back the lace curtain Irish, which is bringing up Daley's own ethnicity and meant to call up a kind of convention and this idea that you can mask an unrefined nature with the trappings of lace, right? Hanging those lace curtains in the window. This Feigen show then brought about other responses in the city. So 10 galleries banded together to run a series of shows through November 1968. 10 different galleries. Much of these were populated with Chicago artists, partially in response to Feigen's group. And indeed, they even held benefits through all of these exhibitions for the ACLU, which was helping to pay for legal defense for those who were being prosecuted from the protests. A couple images in some of these shows right here. Carol Sumner's Kill for Peace, which was part of an artist and writers protest portfolio. So a portfolio produced to fund the anti-war effort. A lot of the proceeds from this portfolio went to the SDS. And then on the right, William Reed's collage work, this one titled Richard is a Wise Old Owl, where Daley's face is kind of put in a collage of a police badge and on the body of an owl. And that work was shown at the Richard Gray Gallery. The MCA held an exhibition, Violence in Recent American Art. This was scheduled before the convention, but took a decidedly different turn, including the exhibition catalog that you're looking at here, which now was comprised of headlines from recent newspapers. And even the work, including Andy Warhol's Race Riot, which you see on the top, was represented as if in a news tabloid or portfolio. So really, artists were trying to think through these various venues, what does it mean to participate and respond through the work in some sort of meaningful way. And they didn't have it sewn up, right? You know, it's almost like there's an intense searching through these exhibitions, but I would argue that it really fundamentally sets the tone for political art after '68. And I'm just going to end with this last slide of Ralph Arnold's work, Who You, Yeah Baby, from 1968. This work was shown in the Feigen exhibition. It was produced by the only gay artist, the only African-American artist included in Feigen's show. And in fact, there was only one woman, Lee Bonteque, also included in those 65 artists in Feigen's show. So that gives us a sense of, the discriminatory nature of the high art establishment, even up until the 1980s. Well, one would argue even up until today. But I want to end with this work, specifically because of Arnold's involvements at the time. When he produced this work, and at the same time as Feigen's show, he was involved in the Southside Community Arts Center, as well as an artist-in-resident at Art and Soul, a collaborative art space in North Lawndale, initiated by the MCA Chicago in an unusual partnership with CVL, or the Conservative Vice Lords, a new manifestation of the West Side gangs. And actually, the art historian Rebecca Zorak, a Northwestern faculty member, has written extensively on Arnold's connection in Art and Soul. In some ways, this work, photo collages commenting on gender, sexuality, race, and politics, despite being included in Feigen's show, demonstrate how focused and in some ways limited my inquiry is. In other words, I'm looking at predominantly white male artists in high-end galleries with tons of commercial viability and in established collections. Yet it still draws forward questions about the efficacy of political art and its ability to intervene in current conflict. If the events of 1968 could infiltrate that tightly controlled context, things must have been pretty bad. Feigen's shows and the other protest exhibitions demonstrate the tenuous relation between the gallery wall and what's happening in the street. And while we often pretend otherwise, these sites are intimately connected, right? We often pretend art's more concerned with the philosophical, the esoteric, or the aesthetic. The events of August 1968 help remind us of the reciprocities between cultural production and lived social experience, which in an era of Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement are crucially important to consider today. Thanks, everyone.
Yes, sir. Okay. That leaves me. I'm still Abe Peck. And in addition to curating this series, I've been involved teaching at Medill since 1980. I'm a former editor and writer for Rolling Stone, where I met Anthony, the Chicago Daily News, and the Chicago Sun-Times. My books include Uncovering the 60s, The Life and Times of the Underground Press. And tonight, what I'm going to do is try to slam dance art and politics together, a certain kind of politic, by recounting the intersection between the highly graphic underground paper that I worked at 50 years ago, the Chicago Seed, and both the permit follies of the mayor's office and the political street theater, specifically of the Hippies. This is one Rashomonic version of what happened here. There are many others. We've heard of others. We'll hear of others on August 8th. But here we go. So the underground press well, first, here I am. There I was, nice college boy in 1965. My cameo appearance in the United States Army Reserves in 1967. Spent right after that, went to the Summer of Love. And then by 1969, I was a winner of the Charles Manson lookalike contest. The first byline I had in the Seed was, yes, Abraham Yippee. So the underground press started, it really was a surge. It went from a handful of papers to more than 500, perhaps even 1,000 papers if you count the high school papers, the prison papers, the GI papers, the Black Dwarf, I think, is on air somewhere, and that Anthony mentioned. And it was a worldwide phenomenon. And the reason it came about was because people were not seeing themselves represented, and the papers themselves would evolve. You'd go to a demonstration, you get chased out, you're protesting the war, and you'd read about how the war was great the next day. Or you'd play some music or smoke some plants or whatever it was, and that was demonic behavior. In terms of what Anthony presented, it's important to know that when the Rolling Stones came here in 1964, the Chicago Tribune interviewed them on the street outside the Tribune building, and they brought a barber down to meet them. In any event, the first underground paper generally is agreed to be the Los Angeles Free Press. A couple of important things about the Free Press: it came out of the Renaissance pleasure fair, so there's the culture. But as you can see, this was their response to the Watts Rebellion. that it wasn't just a fire, it was a fire this time, but that it was actually more political than the papers were letting it on. The Los Angeles Times won a Pulitzer for its coverage, but this was a different kind of coverage, looking from a different frame. And the Berkeley Barb, the enraged ink blot of the East Bay, would cover demonstrations from the protesters' point of view and encourage. It was an activist thing. Block those troop trains that are taking people to this creep show in Vietnam. The third paper was a little tamer, The Paper. A lot of brainstorming over that name, in Michigan, and it was the Students for Democratic Society, the largest young person's organization of the 60s, was their voice. The Fifth Estate in Detroit was the voice of the liberal element in Detroit. 2 years later, we'll be talking about revolution and the MC5. But it was, again, this culture and politics, Dylan and an anti-war march. And the final paper was different. This was the Oracle, edited by a guy named Alan Cohn. His goal was to do LSD on paper. And it used this split fountain technique. It was very Third Eye-ish, if you will, and it really represented the comings and goings of the Summer of Love, which is only a year and a half. I went to the Summer of Love, of course, being my Zelig function. I got there in '67, which is the official Summer of Love. If you talk to people who were living there, they'd say it was really '66, and it was collapsing in '67. The Underground Press, we had our own organization. We had the Underground Press Syndicate, and we had Liberation News Service. We were very anti-copyright. Everyone could, that part of our power was we could share copy from all the other papers. So we had an army of reporters. And we had this disruptive technology, the Gestetner press, that could run stuff off, and photo offset presses later on. So the Seed had precursors in Chicago. There was a paper called Second City, which was more new leftist, but it was collective. It actually distributed the Seed early on, and it was against the basket, racism, poverty, oppression. Another paper was New Left Notes. The Students for Democratic Society was located in Chicago on Madison Street. And this was the organ of Students for Democratic Society. It would be chapter filings, but it was also people going to the North Vietnam and reporting from the other side of the war. The Seed lasted for 7 years. This is a Wikipedia entry, which I did not write, that it was known as quite a pretty paper, but it was also eclectic and non-doctrinaire, even as it radicalized. We did try to include other groups. The Seed started, Trish mentioned something about the maleness of the papers, and David mentioned perhaps the sexism of it. This was a first series of covers, and there are people here from the Seed, veterans of the Seed. This was, before I got there, this was we called sarcastically, the pretty girl cover is a where it's at genre of the Seed. The Seed was started by an artist and a head shop owner, and it was purchased later on by a photographer and a graphic artist who had the illusion that they were going to run a profit-making paper. It was 12 pages, and content-wise, it was really kind of picaresque. This was the Summer of Love. This was people wandering around. It was a lot of stories about road trips, and we're on this journey. We had one of the things that people at the paper wanted to do was have a be-in. And this be-in was in Lincoln Park. It was early in 1967. And this was a run-up, and then pictures from the be-in. And it had Dylan, and it had Ginsberg. But inside, aside from the poetry, there was an article called Abolish the Draft by someone from the Students for Democratic Society. The prose was, tribes assemble at North Avenue Beach. On the 14th day of May, the torch of love and external brotherhood arrived in Chicago. It was dispersed by the police at 5 o'clock, there it was. We had our kind of we had a lot of art. This was a kind of split fountain, so you could run these color washes, another disruptive technology. I don't know who did this graphic, but we also had what we called speed graphics. I'm not saying this one. I don't know who. I don't want to get sued by him. I'm not sure the provenance of this one, but it was a lot of very detailed stuff. And the people who were on methadone actually served a very important function at the seed because we had to use negatives. As we had to stipple the negatives to make sure they were all opaque, and these guys were really good at that. It kept them quite busy. And we had the Holy Trinity, kind of Anthony mentioned, sex. This is one of the tamer ones. Drugs, interview with one of Leary's cohorts, and of course rock and roll. And we had our business. You might be curious what our business model was. Neil, raise your hand. One of our street sellers was here. We had some papers for you. Go down to the corner, and we sold papers on the street. We sold them at head shops. We sold them at clothing stores. There were a lot of hip advertisers. We were priced to move, and we could keep the paper afloat. But we were covering. We also, again, this poem was good enough to run. But we also had folders of different kind of material, movement politics, rock and roll. By far our largest contributor file was what we eventually called No More Goddamn Hippie Poetry, because people would send in stuff about how their toenails grew during their trip, and some of them were actually quite good, some of them weren't ready for prime time, but we had that folder. We satirized the Straits down the block, Marina City. And still had its Midwest roots. And we did cover movement politics. We covered resistance in Madison, resistance in Washington. In the same issue, we had the Oakland draft protests, an article on Che Guevara, and an article on Jimi Hendrix. I did go to the Pentagon March. David, you're wrong. The Pentagon did levitate. And I was with a guy who did get arrested, and he was not treated well. This was kind of our politics that was kind of anarcho-communal, I would call it. We didn't like leaders. We were trying to build counter-institutions that weren't capitalistic, if you will, that would be supporting all these von der Vogel who were floating around the country trying to find the next scene. And we had the hip job co-op and places like that. Probably better at being hip and being cooperative than finding jobs, but that's a different issue. And then enter the Yippies. In March of 1968, the Liberation News Service, our Associated Press of the Underground, announced the Yippies. And the Yippies slogan had two slogans. We demand the politics of ecstasy, misspelled, but very ecstatic nevertheless, and abandon the creeping meatball. And the idea of the Yippies was that movement politics was stolid and boring and just recreating endless meetings, and that meanwhile people were bleeding to death in Vietnam and in the inner city, and that we needed something else. And the idea was to have a street theater, anarchic kind of politic, and the roots were in the free speech movement in Berkeley and in the Diggers, who were kind of in San Francisco especially, also New York, were kind of a free this, free that, built a lot of institutions in San Francisco during the Summer of Love. So this was the first announcement from Liberation News Service, and we of course ran it because it was part and parcel of what was going on. I wrote to Paul Krasner, who was the editor of the Proto-Undergrounder, the Realist, and got Jerry Rubin as my visit in my black-lit apartment on Belden Avenue. Talked to me about what this great festival was going to be, and it was really going to be a disruptive festival, but disruptive creatively, and it was going to represent the real alternative to the Democratic Party, the Death Party, if you will, and to stolid politics. So I wrote the first piece in The Seed, really talking about it as a level, non-leader event, and again, the politics of ecstasy. And the threats were made, about acid in the water supply and kidnapping the delegates. Who'd believe that? Well, guess who? There was a big debate about the Yippies. The village, in March of '68, there was a demonstration in Grand Central Station, a yip-in. A lot of people showed up. Someone climbed, if you know Grand Central Station, there's a big clock in the center of it. Someone climbed there and started manhandling the hands, and the cops broke it up quite strongly. And Village Voice wrote a piece. Someone who was allied with the Yippies wrote this piece, saying it was somehow a prophecy of Chicago. The Barb, a guy named Mike Rossman, who was a very thoughtful movement guy, he knew Jerry Rubin quite well. He hated it. He thought it was deeply dangerous and irresponsible. It was spectacular organizing, but it wasn't working. And New Left Notes, interestingly enough, SDS had a real problem trying to figure out its position in Chicago. Was it coming to demonstrate? Was it coming to radicalize the McCarthy kids? They thought we were using rock and pot to put kids up against the bayonets. Jan Wenner, our old boss, you're still boss, really, he knew the bands and he was not a radical. A self-appointed coterie without a legitimate constituency, as corrupt as the political machine it hoped to disrupt, to which Abbie Hoffman, the Yippie visionary, had later labeled him the Benedict Arnold of the 60s. But others were supportive. Julius Lester, who was one of the most thoughtful writers at The Guardian, not the British Guardian, but the radical paper, The Guardian, frankly, one of the few black writers in the underground press. The underground press was pale and male at this point. And he liked the idea that it was politicizing hippies, that it wasn't just people looking to get stoned, but they had Abbie Hoffman saying was a yippie is a hippie who's been hit over the head with a nightstick, and it was also avoiding New Left nitpicking, and he saw the yippies as a liberated zone. Jerry, always the carnival barker in some ways, even though he's a very, very clever organizer, told me for my book, as long as Chicago was accepted as a legitimate activity that people had an opinion about, I won. The kind of the P.T. Barnum theory of politics. And but the seed was on board. So we had our meeting, and this is in the paper. Now, still kind of black and white. This wasn't the full flower of the seed. And the meeting was raided. I actually had to work that night. I had a job as a waiter so I could make a living. And I missed the meeting. And the police raided the meeting, and there were 20 arrests. The cops only mentioned the 13 men, not the 7 women, interestingly enough. And the other article is the guy with flashing the V is one of the Seminole Seed people, Tree Man, and he would figure into this later on. And I wrote also on the side there an open letter to the mayor that I'll talk about in a second. Well, I'll talk about it now, I guess. The letter talked about to the mayor. It said, Your Honor, we'd be happy to mediate, and these kinds of arrests really don't work, and so let's not do that. And we got an answer. We were assigned a deputy mayor to negotiate with us with the central casting name of Stahl, and he was our compadre there. The next big issue for us, this is important. So later on, a former student of mine, the first time I ever taught was at Columbia College here in Chicago. A woman named Lynn Emmerman wrote for the Reader, wrote this. This was the Red Squad spy at that meeting. The Red Squad was the undercover cops who were anti-left, anti-political. And the guy was saying they all sat around a flashing light, talking, drinking, and blowing pot. The place was a real crash pad with weird black lights. Drinking wine and listening closely to the conversation. Keir, the guy's name, party with the yippies for almost an hour. Quote, finally it hit me that the best way to identify everybody was to raid the place. So I slipped out and called my co-workers at the 18th District, and that was our raid. Things, at this point, I have to say, we heard some dour remarks, and justified, about that time. We were having a good time. This was not, remember the politics of ecstasy, and however you spelled it, there was still some feeling that we could get this thing going. People were freaking freely. People were having fun. People were putting out a paper they loved. But here's the letter for Daley that I wrote. You could shut this thing down, but are the forces at your disposal sufficient to answer public outrage as the sons and daughters of your white middle class are arrested, beaten, or worse? The city was really much more afraid, I'll get to the next slide, of something else, but we were afraid of the aftermath of this. This was our Martin Luther King issue, which actually came out several weeks after he was killed. And we were just, I wrote a back page screed about, it was my despair, David, you know, about how everyone, whether you're a freak or a politico or a racist or whatever, that this has been a body blow, and we're all complicit to this kind of racism. We had covered the National Convention for New Politics, a radical event, but we were also running articles, how to organize. Tree Man wrote that article. He also managed to get arrested in the park for loitering. This was really, a horrible, horrible watershed for us. We then went to, I don't know if anyone here, Mimi, you might have been there, the April 27th Peace March. And this was the march where it was little old ladies for peace, suburban veterans, suburban dentists against the war, and the police were crushed it. I had a friend I made a friend later who was a cop at this event, and he was ordered, everyone was ordered to make arrests. This was Cadre, the Chicago area draft resistors wrote this, that your Daily, this was a shutdown by Daily. We solarized these pictures. Al, I don't know if any of these are yours or not. But we were still yippee, you know. We were flowering. The split fountain thing artistically was beginning to happen for us. We had a demonstration. We were going to give, we were still kind of freaking freely. We were going to give an apple pie Mother's Day event. And we went down to the 18th district with some pies. And the police decided they would not accept the pies, but it was okay to give them to St. Vincent's Hospital around the corner. So if the pies were in fact dosed, we really were going to have the flying nun. But but she put her yippee button on, and Abby, who had been through the New York stuff and had been in the South and was a tougher organizer, he put out a flyer saying "shit pies" next time. So that was a little split already, a little fissure beginning to form. We put out, because we had this April 27th bust, the Free City Survival Committee was negotiating for permits with the city, put out a flyer. We had a benefit at the Electric Theater, which Anthony mentioned, and lo and behold, a new bust to worry about. 1,400 people were thrown out, 26 people were arrested. We need another benefit to pay for this benefit, and we obviously wrote about that. The whole summer was a summer of meetings, of field trips. They were showing us venues that they would never give us. We went to Soldier Field, and we were standing on about the 40-yard line, and Tree Man and I were next to each other, and he looked at me and said, "Lions and Christians," and that we'd be locked in there or something. And eventually, I and some other signatories, for the reasons that Anthony expressed, we withdrew our signatures, and on the grounds that this really was going to be a confrontation. This was me over there with, of course, Tree Man. Don't come if you expect no more than 5 days of music and of life, music, and love, but do come if you deem change necessary. We'll try to walk a tightrope. We were prescient. We were true to the tribe, and we had our fears up. We knew it was going to be a snuff, and this was some of the convention coverage from other people, flyers, students for New Left Notes. And this was our cover for the convention, a big fold-out of a pregnant office worker with Timothy Leary poetry, but also barbed wire fences. And Abby and I had a debate in the paper. I was saying, if you're coming to Chicago, great, be sure to wear some armor in your hair, as opposed to flowers. That changed, and Anthony said, in a short period of time. And Abby wrote something I think that was very prescient. The Seed is a movement paper that teaches by example. Look, we are a family. Here is our soul. It's an important message, but the Seed is the last in the line of flower papers. Abe and the other Seed people wouldn't miss it, wouldn't be working so hard for it. And lo and behold, we were working hard during the whole convention. I really kind of became a reporter. I covered I was in the park every night. Lincoln Park was my territory. I went down to Henroten Hospital, which doesn't exist anymore, as they were bringing people who were beaten in. Really covered the street. We were sitting in our office, and suddenly we had an office that fortunately you had to walk in and go down some steps, and suddenly our window shattered. We had been shot at. Our office had been shot at, and because we were holy fools, we ran outside, and the only car was a blue and white car cruising slowly north. It was a message from the guys around the corner. This was I'm going to speed through the rest of the slides because the convention is over now. This was our watershed. A guy, some of you know, Michael James came in, who just owned the Heartland Cafe and would be in another paper called Rising Up Angry. He came into my office and said, "We used to be this." And they took my hand and he folded it, and now we're this. And that was a kind of a change in the paper. And we went through all these, but however, the police would give us the middle finger salute too. During the conspiracy trial, I was back right after Woodstock. I came back here, and that was more of our split fountain art in service of the trial, but also catching a certain amount of movement on stop the trial, stop this, stop everything. Napalm was now a cover story. We were covering the war constantly as it dragged on. We were very eco-conscious, even though if you took a look at the seat office, you'd never think so. We had our continued critique of consumerism. We did this Liberate Yourself Now card, get rid of credit, get rid of the money economy. We got 300 requests for the card, which we could never fulfill, of course, we had What Trees Do They Plant? This was the People's Park cover from Berkeley. And again, we were trying to build this counter community. We were trying to build liberated zones of movement organizations. The heads and the fists were coming together, Red Star and Pot, arms and guitars. And we were trying to make radical points artfully. We tried to go to tropes, if you will, baseball cards, but for underground artists, underground our political leaders, the Statue of Liberty. It seems Trish skulls really were a theme, huh? And Rising Up Angry was a new bloom, came along trying to organize tougher white working class kids. And then this was the other watershed, the raid of essentially a murder team. Operation Phoenix comes to Chicago of the killing of 2 Black Panthers in Chicago in December '69. We put out a broadside. The city did its own TV show that was exposed by both underground and overground media. And our politics were becoming more and more counterculture. We had a lot of comics, and the comics were put in service of the politics. With a certain kind of Skip Williamson, the cartoonist, unfortunately died fairly recently, but there's a certain kind of tweaking of ourselves. Are we serious radicals or not? It got very serious. There was a bombing a day in America by 1970. The revolution within the revolution, the feminization of the paper became a collective. The revolutions were coming so fast and furious that this was a double revolution issue. We had the Native American issue because the Native Americans had taken over. Believe it or not, I don't know if you remember this, there was a Nike base along the lake on Addison Street. And that was our mini Alcatraz here. And the gay rights revolution. So I don't know how many gay Indians read the paper, that issue, but I'm sure some, but we did a double revolution there. And then Kent State happened. But we came out late for Kent State, and inside we had this kind of tough coverage. But there was a paper called the San Jose Red Eye that ran this graphic, and somehow that really appealed to us. It was just, oh my God, can you believe they did this? So it's Mickey Mouse wearing a Richard Nixon watch, and that was our best-selling issue. Neil probably made a living that week. They sold 35,000 copies very quickly. And then the Seed soldiered on until 1974. But believe it or not, in the midst of crying for a revolution, we had to pay our taxes so we wouldn't get closed down. And I was gone by then, but they kind of stopped paying them, and the tax man came, and it was just time. People, the ad base was gone. People wanted a second pair of jeans. People were burned out. The U.S. was out of Vietnam, even though the war raged on so that was it. So of course, the irony, of course, in the long story short, is my book on the underground press got me tenure. But this was the ride and an attempt to have art and politics fused around political movements. Just a couple of thoughts about today. We're going to have a whole panel on August 8th. I hope you come. Rick Pearlstein, Don Rose, Charles Whitaker, and a young intersectional activist, Charlene Carruthers, will be here to talk about the legacy. But just a few thoughts. The revolution didn't happen, but there were many positive changes, some of which are now being the counter culture is attacking. Multiple points of view replaced the journalistic voice of God, but of course now we have so many voices, it's Babel. And then Trump, in an odd way, is the ultimate yippee tactician. Politics very different, but he knows how to use spectacle and sensation and pseudo events. So here we are, and here we go again. So I'm going to ask the panelists to come back up, if you will, and we'll take your questions. But thank you very much. And, because C-SPAN is taping, we have to ask you to come up to take questions. So anyone who wants to ask a question, please go. Go ahead, Rick. Go ahead, please.
I don't know. We no longer have a mic here.
We'll pass it along.
Oh, okay.
Hi, how you doing? No.
So, will I be? Should I speak here or what?
Yeah.
So anyway, it was great to hear about the seed, because that is really how I remember the 60s, the alternative press, all of our alternative spaces. We had a little bookstore on Armitage Avenue, and we were also alternative artists.
Right.
We were surrealists and psychedelic artists. And it's hard to look back and place some of the importance on some of the older artists when we lived in a world of youth, and it was our own culture and really quite separate from the other society. So I hardly recognized some of the descriptions of Chicago, even though I worked in the SDS national office, and I was at a lot of the riots. Now, we had an exhibition on Eugenie Street, a surrealist exhibition in Lincoln Park, and the 3 papers reviewed it. But one of them came in and said, "Oh, surrealist, you're surrealist." And then they said, they started talking politically. And so the people in the gallery said, "Yes, we're surrealists, but we're also anti-imperialist." And when it came into the paper, it was anti-materialist. So they almost fainted. How can they call us anti-materialist? So anyway, we recently had another alternative show celebrating our 50th anniversary of the protest show. So there was a panel at the University of Chicago and all sorts of things. But I really look back on those days in wonder at the things we did. They were fantastic. And I'm also very sad because when we lost 58,000 people in that war, I mean, we were sure we would lose our relatives or our boyfriends or our girlfriends. And it was a very serious time. And I don't know how we managed to keep our optimism, but we did. And so I hope we will again.
Thank you, Penelope. Right. And why don't you say who you are also? Yeah. Penelope, just identify yourself. Yeah.
Oh, I'm Penelope Rosemont, and Chicago surrealist, still painting and doing things like that. I worked with SDS for a long time, and then I worked with the Charles H. Kerr Publishing Company.
Great, thanks. Okay, Rick?
Thanks for coming, guys. I'm Rick Pearlstein. I write about this period. The thing that struck me reading Mailer's accounts of the Pentagon protest, Armies of the Night, and his work on the Democratic Convention was the bad guys felt kind of like stock cardboard characters to me. One thing that sticks out in my mind is he refers to one of the young military police. He describes him in great detail, his face, as he did with Daley, I think, and calls him a fascist. And I remember thinking, well, he's probably might even be a draftee. You know, he has is the same age as the people he's arresting. I didn't feel like Mailer saw the people he opposed politically as problems to be understood, but foils for the story he was telling. Am I misremembering? Is that unfair?
There are sympathetic and unsympathetic passages about the military police in Armies of the Night, and yes. I'm trying to recall, because he does discuss how these guys come from small towns and get drafted and pushed into either the Army or the National Guard or the military police. And he does do that with sympathy when he faces them, in ranks. He's certainly not sympathetic. And some of them behave very violently in Washington and certainly here. So, I mean, in those days there were limits to empathy, which I think you're suggesting is that's a spiritual failure.
Yeah, I mean, a journalistic failure. There's so much work that other people did that was so interesting. I would think of a Chicagoan, since we're talking about the rivalry between New York and Chicago, named John Schultz, who wrote an amazing book about the convention and an amazing book about the Chicago 7 trial, in which he writes about the jury and the debates that went on about child rearing, things like that.
Well, can I just update the issue?
Sure.
Which is, Frank Rich wrote a piece in New York Magazine about 7 or 8 months after the election and said, "To hell with the Trump voters." Because there have been, lots of books and some good ones about the people who voted for Trump or in the kind of culture that they were in and the difficulties they had. And his point was, if they can't see that their own interests are not being represented by the Republican Party, they're not going to see anything. So, I mean, that's an updating of the...
That's what I'll be talking about next month.
Okay.
We'll be talking next month. Thank you. And, anyone else? Can you come up? Great. And say who you are.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Alex King. I'm part of the Goodman Theater Musical Theater Program, and we're doing something. Yes. Oh, my name is Alex King. I'm part of the Goodman Theater Musical Theater Program, and we're actually studying 1968 right now. And my question is, how through media and art do we create conversation between sort of this older generation in the 1960s and the newer generation that is alive and thriving right now?
As opposed to... Well.
I'm just wondering.
That's all right. Well, I'll be the first geezer to respond. And but first, I should add that Trish was born in 1969. So last night we decided she was conceived during the convention. But I think one thing we have to do as the predecessors is listen. There is stuff to learn from our experiences, pro and con. And I think social media is a place where that can come together. And I also think that as we again harden, one of my lessons is to be bold. But another lesson is that if you make the eye of the needle too thin, not very many people can fit through it. So we have to be both expansive and still have some principles and standards. Yeah. I don't know if anyone else wants to.
I was going to say. I teach, and I'm struck. I think young people are often sort of caricatured, really, in the media. I'm struck by how open students are to talking about, these kinds of experiences and interest in finding out about it. And similarly, they're interested in kind of sharing. I think, with social media, that's certainly one way, but events like this and other ways to just kind of honestly bring what your experience is. Right at the moment, I really feel that for some reason the exact term is escaping me, but I think we need a big tent. I think excluding people, for one reason or another, when things are really going well, you can start having those fights. But I think at the moment, age and all of the other kind of things that might divide people who think of themselves as progressive, maybe should be set aside. And I think your question of finding ways to explore them is definitely important.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Anyone else?
I was going to.
Okay, please. We'll have time. We're going to go on with the Q&A for just a bit, but we'll have time. Everyone's going to stay, and we can always talk. But
the sociologist Daniel Bell described himself as a socialist in economics, a liberal in politics, and a conservative in culture. Well, that's a joke, but it sort of describes me. And so I would say, of course, we have to listen to what your concerns are and what your hopes and frustrations and fears and desires are. But I would also ask you guys to exercise some historical consciousness, to get out of pop culture and media culture all the time. I mean, I was a movie critic for 45 years, and internally I was always fleeing, and writing other things. So, I mean, I don't care how square this sounds, but it means, seeing old movies, seeing great old plays when they're revived, reading people like Mailer or any great literature, and even journalism from Abe's period and my period. In other words, exercise historical consciousness and try to just find the best stuff you can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Don Rose. I'm going to be speaking next week. I'm going to be speaking next week, and I'm going to expand on this point. But I think just for the sake of historical accuracy, the Yippies were not the primary organizers of the demonstrations at the convention.
Right.
They were, and it hadn't been mentioned here, but just for those of you who won't be here next week, an organization called the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, which had been sponsoring peace marches for several years, including a 1 million-person march in New York, began organizing right after the Pentagon March. David Dellinger and Tom Hayden were the leaders of this. Rennie Davis, another person who became a conspiracy trial subject, and defendant, that's the word I was looking for. The MOB included a very wide range of civil rights, radical political, all kinds of organizations. It included the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and early SDS and Students for Democratic Society. By the time of the convention, held off and then later joined it. But earlier leaders of the Students for Democratic Society included people like Tom Hayden. And the organizing went on from November of '67 on through the entire convention, and the main rally that was broken up and the march that was being planned, the march that never took place, was organized by the MOB and joined by a lot of the Yippies who had made their base in Lincoln Park. So I just wanted.
No, we're all doing pieces of the puzzle, right?
Yeah. Right. So there's just too many pieces, so I've decided next week to give a brief history of everything that happened at the convention.
To keep us sane, it's next month. But yes, we look forward to it, Don. Yeah. Mimi, why don't you come up and then... And then we'll take one more question after Mimi, because we have some closing business. Can you reach it?
But I just have to say, apropos of what Don just said, that's true. Historically, that's who did the main organizing and so on. But it was really the Yippies who spoke to so many of us who were kind of more countercultural and trying new things and so on. The national mobilization, I would not take away from its importance, but it didn't have the heart and the soul of what was happening with all of us who were young at that time.
Thank you. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. All right. So what we're going to do, we're going to stay. I want to make sure you know that the panelists who have books will be available for signing. Bethany will have her CDs. We'll probably have other stuff, but we want to we have some closing business. Again, our next panel, which Don will be at, and the others will be at, is August 8th. Please come. And Bethany, can we get you back wherever you are? And Patrick. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
You're watching American History TV. Only